Dungeons & Dragons is owned by Wizards of the Coast, which, in the last couple of years, has made a series of controversial decisions. In other words, they're a large company, doing large company things. But if you're at all familiar with D&D, you're probably aware that, like many titans of industry, it started in a basement, with a dream. So how did things go from 3 passionate guys to a billion-dollar behemoth? Well, it wasn't a straight path. It's a story of tragedies, of betrayals, and perhaps most of all, of greed. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson developed the rules for the original Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax wanted to do more with it than just play it, so he founded Tactical Studies Rules, hereby referred to as TSR because Tactical Studies Rules is a crazy name. He founded TSR alongside his longtime friend and fellow wargamer Don Kay. Each of them invested $1,000 into TSR, which wasn't enough to get D&D printed, but it was enough to get to Gen Con in 1973. A lot of that had to do with the fact that Gary Gygax was the founder of Gen Con, but still, come on. Here, they met Brian Bloom. Bloom also liked wargaming, but more importantly, Brian Bloom had $2,000. And the additional $2,000 was not only enough to get Dungeons & Dragons printed for the first time, it was also enough to get Brian Bloom into the 3-way partnership. D&D was a hit. Sales rose, it's a fun game, and for 2 years things were looking really, really good. But in the first tragedy of this story, in 1975, Don Kay unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. His whole estate passed on to his wife, Donna. Nothing specific was laid out for TSR. Because of this, Gygax and Bloom restructured into TSR Hobbies. Each of them got a number of shares. Gygax got 150 and Bloom got 100. But they had this new company and nothing to do with it because TSR Hobbies didn't own D&D. TSR did. And a third of that was owned by Donna Kay. It would be simple, except that neither Gygax nor Bloom could afford to buy the shares from Kay. So, in the first of a series of smooth-talking moves, Brian Bloom convinced Donna Kay and Gary Gygax that she could sell her shares to his father. From there, the shares of TSR were converted into shares of TSR Hobbies, which boiled down to Brian Bloom having 100 shares of TSR Hobbies and his father having 200 shares of TSR Hobbies. At the same time, Brian leveraged his option to buy more shares of TSR Hobbies, 140 to be exact. So, he went from having 100 to having 240, and his father had 200. This was the result of both Brian and Gary having the option to buy up to 700 shares of TSR Hobbies. It sounds a little mumbo-jumbo-y right now. That is very important. It'll come up later. The next thing that Brian Bloom did is he convinced everyone involved that his dad's shares should be sold to his brother, Kevin. And it happened. So, by 1980, the Bloom brothers owned 440 shares of TSR Hobbies, the owner of D&D. And Gary Gygax, the creator of D&D, owned 150. In essence, Gary Gygax was now an employee of the Bloom brothers. And that's kind of where the trouble started. You see, from 1975 when Kay passed away to 1980 when Gygax went from being a majority to a minority shareholder, a lot had happened in regards to D&D. He had hired on his co-creator Dave Arneson to help flesh out the rules of D&D, but they had also decided to split the game in two. You might have heard of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. That's because Dungeons & Dragons in the first edition was initially the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They were two different games, and they were actually not very compatible. Gygax was only paying Arneson commission on the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons, but at the same time he was fleshing out Advanced Dungeons & Dragons a lot more. He was releasing the Monster Manual, the Second Monster Manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, which all went along with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This caused issues between the two of them, and it would result in a lawsuit in 1979 between Arneson and TSR, a lawsuit that Arneson won. Also in 1979, the second tragedy of our story. James Dallas Egbert III disappeared in the steam tunnels underneath Michigan State University. He disappeared while playing a LARP, a live-action role-play, which was immediately tied to Dungeons & Dragons, and helped to kick off what's known today as the Satanic Panic. This was the movement against role-playing games throughout the 80s, seeing them as cultish behavior with the intent of summoning the devil. This was very real, and as the leader in the games industry, the tabletop games industry, D&D was far and away the most heavily affected. There was even an organization called BADD, B-A-D-D, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. That was also real. They sent attack letters and everything. It was a whole campaign. So a lot was going on, and in the midst of it all, Gary Gygax agreed that the Bloom brothers could buy the shares that were floating around and not part of TSR. You can kind of understand how it would happen. The problem was, as soon as it did happen, the two sides started to fight. Gygax and the Bloom brothers. To resolve the issues, they split TSR again, this time 4 ways, but the important one that matters right now is TSR Entertainment, which they made Gary Gygax the CEO of. But as the CEO of TSR Entertainment, he had to go find a way to make entertainment. So the Bloom brothers were justified in sending Gary Gygax out to Hollywood to develop a TV show, to develop a movie, and he did so. And Gygax did all the classic Hollywood stuff. He divorced his wife, he ripped a bunch of coke, he signed Orson Welles to a Dungeons & Dragons movie.
Ah, the French.
And just as things were starting to happen, well, he found out that TSR was starting to go belly up. Listen, I know business is hard, I really, really do, but it seems like dredging up a 19th century ship just for fun on the company's dime is not something you should do. And it is something that the Bloom brothers did. You know, also pay the people that print your books, probably a decent start. And if you're going to appoint a bunch of outside directors, here's a thought. Maybe make sure they're people that actually know anything about the industry you're working in. But that's just my opinion. So, Gygax ran back from Hollywood to Wisconsin to try to see what he could do to save TSR. His company, kind of, but not really anymore because he's just a minority shareholder. But he still founded it, so he'd like to save it. He ran a full investigation and successfully petitioned the board to get rid of brother Kevin Bloom, who was at that time the CEO of TSR Hobbies. Kevin Bloom was removed, but unfortunately the board decided that things were still bad, and they were going to need someone to buy the company if it wanted to continue to exist. Gygax did not want this to happen, and at this point, he leveraged his option to buy the remainder of his 700 shares. With his original shares and his 700 shares, he now had just barely the majority of the company. But barely a majority is still very much a majority. So, Gygax was now CEO, he was running the company. He was the majority shareholder for the first time since its inception. Finances were not looking great, but the product was still very good and selling well. There was lots to be hopeful for, and thinking that he was getting stuff back on track, Gary Gygax hired a company manager that he had met through connections in Hollywood named Lorraine Williams, just to help with the day-to-day, get things back on track, bring funding in. Lorraine Williams was good at that, and she began to do that. Things were looking up. But the Bloom brothers were not done yet. You see, while Gary Gygax was buying up the remainder of his 700 shares, so was Brian Bloom. He knew him and his brother were on their way out, and they wanted to milk TSR for anything they could before they were fully gone. That meant they needed to find a way to get as many shares as they could, and then get rid of as many shares as they could. And who better to sell all of their shares to than the current company manager, Lorraine Williams. Despite initially refusing to invest in the company, Williams had managed to get TSR a little bit back on its feet. Money was coming in, things were starting to look up. D&D was still popular. So when the Blooms offered their shares, she took them up on it. Gygax was sitting at his maximum number of shares, 700 as well as his initial 150, for a total of 850 shares. The Blooms had between them Donna Kaye's shares, the initial 100 for Brian Bloom, and the additional 700 that Brian Bloom was entitled to purchase. For those with the quick math skills, that brings us to a total of 1,000 shares, which meant after the sale went through, Lorraine Williams was now the majority shareholder of TSR. And she fired Gary Gygax. He fought the sale of the shares in court, but he lost, and he was out. So by 1985, just 12 years after starting the game and founding the company, Gygax was no longer involved with it. Now at this point I want to clarify something. Gary Gygax has come across a bit as like a folksy, put upon, heroic type, who's running from place to place, trying to save D&D. In many ways that's true, but as a person Gary Gygax still had many flaws. He was a human being after all. Simply looking at the early versions of the game, you'll get a good sense of his particular prejudices and biases. His treatment of women and minorities was far from unique at the time, but it did also set things back. In short, I'm not here to say that Gary Gygax was a good person, but what Gary Gygax was doing in this story was trying his best for the game that he loved. And the people who manipulated it out of his hands, it's pretty clear were only in it for a buck. But making money and having a good game tend to go hand in hand. So, at this point, under the Lorraine Williams reign, I want to talk a little bit about game design. Because all of this corporate wrestling really just had to do with a little fantasy game. And the reason for that was because people liked it and they were buying it. TSR had created a game and then started to flesh out the game around the core rules. Gygax and Arneson had developed it, it was done, they were adding to it. Under Lorraine Williams, that changed quite a lot. The biggest change was 2nd edition. Taking revisions to a new level, TSR released a whole new edition of the game. You're probably familiar with this in the sense that today we play 5th edition with a new version coming out right now. And creating a new edition helped in a lot of ways, but maybe not quite the way as you're thinking. It did reduce the amount of controversial subject matter like the devils and demons that the Satanic Panic was on about. It removed some more suggestive art, and it had some very minor rules changes, but on the whole, the actual rules didn't change a drastic amount. What really changed was the theme and the tone. It went from high fantasy swords and sorcery to a much more medieval style blank slate kind of fantasy. What this did was allow TSR to release a lot of setting modules and campaign modules. And not only do that, but do it in a wider variety of styles. If it wasn't all swords and sorcery, well, you could have Spelljammer for sci-fi fans, you could have Dark Sun for post-apocalyptic fans, you could have Ravenloft for horror fans. This would end up being Lorraine Williams' strength, but also a bit of a weakness. You see, this huge amount of settings and modules meant getting a lot of new people into the game, because if they had a theme that they liked, well, now they could play it. But it also split the core of the fan base in a big way, because if you like Ravenloft, and you get into Ravenloft, and then they stop releasing Ravenloft because they're releasing Dark Sun, well, now what do? There's nothing more for you to buy because they're not developing Ravenloft anymore. Additionally, the core of the fan base was sword and sorcery fans. That's what the original D&D was. So where are they supposed to go with this new blank slate style of fantasy? But for all of that, it totally might have worked out if it wasn't for the really weird deals they had with their publisher and their banks that were horribly over-leveraged, that put them in a ton of debt, that ended up ending the reign of Lorraine Williams. The way the publishing agreement worked out in the 80s boiled down to this. Random House, the publisher, normally distributed books and then kept a portion of the revenue for themselves. They passed the rest on to the rights owner, in this case that would have been TSR. But for TSR's deal, they ended up reversing it. You see, because TSR had already worked out a bunch of deals with game stores around the world, they could go to Random House and say, look at all these guaranteed contracts we have. If you pay us up front so that we can produce the books, then our sales that are guaranteed because of these contracts will pay back the debts to you, our publisher, Random House. This started off as a great deal for everyone because TSR could produce their books with no upfront cost to themselves, and Random House could guarantee sales because TSR was bringing them contracts with sellers. So what happened? Well, in essence, TSR couldn't really track the sales of books, so they were producing runs of books that were way too big for their popularity, and they were being fronted the money. So when those books didn't sell, their debts didn't get paid off. And because they were producing a wide variety of settings and styles, it was even harder to track. Maybe Ravenloft sold really well, so you can expect Dark Sun to sell really well. But hey, all those Ravenloft fans, they like Ravenloft. They're not gonna buy Dark Sun. And what's that? New people didn't turn up for Dark Sun, which is the whole point of releasing a wide variety of styles. That's fine. We're in debt now, but hey, next year we're gonna release a new setting that's gonna get all of these new people in. And that's not only gonna pay off our past debts, but now it's gonna turn a profit. Ignore the fact that we're not getting total value for our sold products because we give a bunch of discounts to all of our sellers because that's why they signed the contract in the first place. And also ignore the fact that we're in a bunch of debt to Random House because we're gonna pay those debts off. And as long as they don't notice that we're in debt to them, yeah, so Random House noticed that they were drastically in debt and they asked TSR for the $11.3 million they were owed. And in 1993, a tabletop game developer rejected the game because it was too bulky and hard to produce and carry around. The creator came back and said, well, hey, if I develop a game that's easier to carry around and easier to produce, would you produce it? And they said, yeah, that's literally what we just asked for. And so Magic the Gathering was born. Magic the Gathering was produced by Wizards of the Coast, and it was hugely successful. Successful enough, they had enough cash to buy TSR. Wizards now owned Dungeons & Dragons. Fitting, I know. They bought D&D in 1997 and immediately got to work on 3rd edition. In 1999, Wizards of the Coast was bought by Hasbro. As far as I can tell, this was just for the money. Doesn't appear as though Wizards of the Coast was in any kind of financial trouble, which kind of makes stomaching the modern age a little bit harder. If they were at least scrabbling for coins, maybe you could justify some of this. In 2000, the 3rd edition was released, along with the OGL, or Open Gaming License, which allowed the community to create playable content for itself. It was fantastic. The Open Gaming License really opened a whole new world to the community to be a community with each other. The original creator of Wizards of the Coast left the company in 2001. 4th edition was released in 2008, but saw a lot less excitement from the community and was replaced fairly quickly in 2014 by 5th edition, which is what we have today. for a little while longer. Wizards of the Coast, as of today, has owned Dungeons & Dragons for 27 years, more than half of its lifetime. More than twice as long as Gary Gygax had any control over it. D&D is owned by a huge corporation, which is owned by a huger corporation. They're still buying new companies to try to bring more people into D&D, and the company is still making blunders. They're using AI art when they said they wouldn't, and they're sending Pinkertons to people's houses for basically no reason. But in the most telling move, in 2021, Wizards of the Coast attempted to roll back large parts of the open gaming license, that little deal that let the community create content for itself. In response, that core fan base revolted. In the wake of that decision, new rules created by new behemoths emerged to compete directly with D&D. Wizards of the Coast reversed their decision. They reinstated the OGL and placed it in the hands of the Creative Commons so that they could no longer alter it in any way. But in making the original decision to begin with, in attempting to roll back the original OGL, they revealed that they had slipped into the ways of the TSR of old, of the Bloom brothers, and to a lesser extent of Lorraine Williams. They were in it for the money. D&D is wildly successful. It's successful because it's fun. At the end of the day, it's just people sitting around a table playing pretend. But capturing that feeling is hard, and because D&D does it pretty well, and did it first, a lot of success has followed. I don't know what the future holds for D&D. It's had its ups, it's had its downs. But I do know that until the owners of D&D like the game as much as the community does, it's going to continue to be what it has been since Don Kay passed away too soon in 1975. It's going to be a bit of a tragedy.